What's up everybody? Finally we're getting around to having a look at the Williams FW43, their new car, here in its livery launch or its digital render launch, but of course now we have seen it on track as well. So I've got some photos of that. I'm not going to go through everything on this car because as we move through the lineup of cars for this year, particularly given that this is the last year of this stable set of regulations, lots of people are starting to converge on lots of design details. So what I'm going to try and do is pick out some of the differences around this car, and hopefully that will give us a little bit of insight into the way that Williams are looking to try and recover after such a difficult period of time they've been through. Right, looking at the car out on track in Barcelona, this is week one, test one. The first thing that probably strikes you is the front wing. It has a definite difference to most other people's way of looking at this. Only in terms of its design, not in terms of its actual concept, but the inside inside elements of those front wing flaps, definitely the downforce producing part of the wing. As with some other teams, you know, this is very much the way lots of teams have gone, but the way Williams have looked at it is they've literally separated both halves of the wing. The inboard section, very much upright, very much expansive, a huge big surface area, an angle of attack for that downforce production. The outside end with a split halfway along the front wing flap, very much laid flat, very much about directing flow out through that channel, out past the end plate and dragging away with it the sort of messy, interrupted tyre wake, taking that away from the car. Now, the reason they've gone for this is perhaps because they are literally looking to define the two different elements or the two different purposes of the sides of the wing. By putting a definite split with a definite change of angle halfway along, you are creating a more purposeful channel along this edge. If you have a transition between the outside flatter parts and the inside more upright parts, you have an area during that transition process which is sort of halfway in between. It's not necessarily all about downforce, and equally it's not necessarily about driving that outwash flow either. So I can understand the thinking behind it. Whether it's better or worse, only Williams will know that, having run it in a wind tunnel and looked at the data from it. But clearly I think that's their thinking behind it. Nobody else really following in that suit yet. I've seen lots of people say how this must be less efficient. I can only assume that Williams have looked at the data from this and decided it's not less efficient, and that's why they've gone for that direction. So it'll be interesting to follow this and see if this is how they continue over the course of the season. The front wing, I guess, very similar. The nose cone very similar to last year in terms of it's still one of the last wide noses. And lots of people have said to me, isn't it an obvious disadvantage having the wide nose? And it's not as clear cut as that. It's not that a narrow nose has huge aero benefits in terms of its frontal area. Of course, that's one element to it. But the other part of these nose cones is, and the reason we have them and the details in them, is how the airflow spills over the sides of this and how it interacts then with the width of the chassis. Of course, if you have a very narrow nose, you then have a very definite transition where it has to widen out to meet the rest of the chassis. So by having a nose cone that's wider all the way along, you have different effects or different impacts of the airflow spilling over the side and running down into the sections of the suspension, and crucially into this area underneath the nose. So not necessarily that one's definitely better or worse than the other. Just think about it, in previous years most teams had this kind of setup. So current thinking tending to move towards the more narrow nose, but that doesn't necessarily mean that this is a terrible idea. So let's not write them off before they've begun. This car's a definite evolution. They had a lot of problems with their car last year, but most of those, or a large part of those, were correlation related. So that means the data they were getting from their wind tunnels and their CFD systems back in the factory, which said things should be great, said they had a great baseline, when they put the car on the racetrack, it didn't work the same way. They weren't getting the same feedback, they weren't getting the same data. And that makes it incredibly difficult to develop your car because you don't know which direction to go in. The amount of on-track time, testing-wise, is so limited now. You rely so heavily on the elements, the tooling that you have back at the factory in terms of that simulation software and the tunnel time. If you haven't got a good correlation between the two, you're kind of screwed. Now the other thing that stands out from this car, I guess, is the fact that their front suspension Very high, that's not unusual, but extremely high. I mean, even way higher than the Mercedes. If you look at the bracket extending out from the upright to that top front wishbone at the outboard edge, that's one of the highest that I've seen. Really, really extended, raised up as high as possible. The idea being to create a clear path for this big Y250 vortex that spills off these front wing tips on the inboard edge here. Incidentally, that Y250 section, which is this neutral section in the middle of the front wing, that goes for next year. So the Y250 vortex, which is this big, powerful vortex that spins up off each of these wingtips and then combines together to form probably the most powerful vortex on the car, channeling its way right towards the rear. That goes to some extent from next year. So the last year of that. But that's why the suspension's raised up, to clear a path for that to pass uninterrupted through towards the barge boards and on towards the rear of the car. But very, very high section for the installation for the suspension. Also unusually, and this is why I'm struggling to understand from Williams, is that they are one of the last teams really to put their track rod, the steering arm, which is this central member here, on its own. So now we have lower wishbone, upper wishbone. That diagonal one is the push rod, of course. This here is the steering track rod. Now most teams have combined that with either the upper or lower wishbone inside the same aerodynamic shroud, for the very simple reason that that's one less piece in the airstream. So you have less interruption through this particularly tricky area through here. Now, of course, to do that, you have to find an installation of the steering rack, which sits somewhere in here, that can, you know, sit either low or high to be able to accommodate that setup. And I know that's definitely a complication. But for me, it seems like the aerodynamic negative of having another suspension member in the airstream, for me, is just seems like a simple win to get rid of that. But anyway, that's the way they've gone for, that's why they've gone for it, and that's the setup they've gone with. Incidentally, these great big pods here, and actually lots of people ask me about the Racing Point, which has the huge pods on the side up here. What are they? They are infrared cameras looking at tyre temperatures, so tyre surface temperatures and sidewall temperatures. Some of them will also be using slow motion cameras to look at things like wing deflections, but these pods, the standard camera mounts, can be used to fit all sorts of testing instrumentation in terms of visual instrumentation whilst we're in pre-season testing. So that's what these things are. They're either looking at tyre wall deflection and movement, perhaps wing deflection, or perhaps even temperatures of the tyres as well. If we look at the car out on the racetrack, you can clearly see we've got a very high rake angle on the Williams. That's not necessarily new, but that is something that's a path that they are definitely following. And what strikes me as well on this is how they've gone for a very similar, and perhaps this is unsurprising, very similar design on the engine cover around the side pods here to the Mercedes. Shrink wrapped, as we called it before, around that radiator. So really, really sucked in incredibly tight. And the actual inlets for the side pods are one of the smallest I've seen. And one of Williams' problems last year was that it was overcooled. So the side pods were bigger than they needed. They had more space under here than they needed. So that caused a huge amount of drag when they didn't need that amount of airflow through there for cooling. So slimmed that right down. Now we already know that the Mercedes has a better cooling efficiency on their power unit this year, because the Mercedes team have even said that. Therefore they need less airflow through the whole system to allow it to run at normal operating temperatures, or the elevated temperatures that it now is able to run at. So that means, as an aerodynamic benefit, you get to shrink this right down, and that of course reduces drag. One area that's not necessarily shrunk down as much though is this area here. I don't know if you can see it from this picture, but that's very bulbous around this part of the engine cover. Almost suggests that they've put some of the paraphernalia that would have gone in the side pod, perhaps an extra radiator, and I haven't seen a picture underneath yet, but perhaps they've got extra cooling up on top of the airbox up there. But the back end, or the top end of that, seems particularly inflated. There's obviously a centre of gravity penalty with that, but perhaps the aero benefit is better up here than having that bulk down in this area here, where you can create a really big undercut to allow the airflow to pass around the edge of that and into that critical area at the back of the floor. So some interesting thought processes around here, probably in some way some large way, led by that Mercedes power unit as it's been developed by the main team. Some really interesting work around the barge boards, lots of work in fact, really detailed, not the best picture in the world, but there's a lot of detail around that. They've created a tunnel, if you like, through this vertical element here and this big steep undercut underneath the radiator to create a tunnel that will accelerate the airflow down and around this section here. So that's quite a nice, interesting element that's been added for this year, or developed at least for this year. And I suspect still lots more work to come on this particular area. The rear wing, I think I've seen them try a couple of different rear wings on the Williams over that first test. But again, nothing groundbreaking, just lots of variation on what lots of other people are trying. But the big thing with the Williams is if they can overcome some of the big deficits, like the excessive drag that they had, like the correlation issues that they came up against last year, well then they have a car that's a great basis. Not only that, it's a car that can then be developed throughout the season. Even though we've got this thing with 2021 looming, if you've got a car that's as good out the box as this one seems to be in terms of where it was last year, well then you've got a chance of fighting. Where they were last year was they were slow, they were unreliable, but even bigger than that was they couldn't develop the car because the direction they wanted to go or the feedback they were getting just didn't tie in with what every piece of data and information that was coming out of the factory. You can't go anywhere like that. So hopefully they've addressed a lot of those issues, and I suspect that this year will hopefully be quite a lot better.